best for last. I don't want to say that all the previous panels were not interesting, but the title, The Ideal and the Attainable on Higher Education, seems to me, as a journalist, to be in a nutshell the essence of the Greek saga of reforms in universities, which is a painful story. I don't know how much we'll get into it. I will start by presenting the two speakers that haven't been presented and haven't spoken so far. Professor Mr. Nikos Vettas, Director of IOBE and Professor of Economics at the Athens University, and Vassilis Vassalos next to him, who is also a professor at the Department of Informatics and Director of the Master of Science in Data Science, also at the University of Athens, at the Department of Economics and Business. And just to guide the discussion so that we don't get lost in translation and the Greek specifics, I would like to start by asking Mr. Vettas to share his thoughts on if there are ways to apply in Greek higher education best practices from abroad without changing the legal framework, taking in mind which is the limitations of the current legal framework. So you all have about 5 minutes. I will be very strict. Please, Mr. Vettas.
Okay, I think the plan is that Vassilis will talk first. He's a Stanford guy. I'm not from Stanford. I'm just a guest. So you go.
Okay, so thank you all for being here. So it appears to be a difficult question. What can we do in Greek university education without concerning ourselves with the legal framework and restrictions this poses? Yet, my opinion is that if we look at it sort of a bit carefully, it's an easier question than it looks. So, despite the problems and the shortcomings, and there are many, of the current legal framework and of the legal framework over the past 50 years, there is a lot of room for the university education system in Greece to improve and to deliver really world-class education to our students. The areas where that is most possible are the areas most connected with how students learn. So even our restrictive legal framework gives a lot of room for curriculum development and for applying instructional techniques that are better for students. And this is the area where I think most of us working in Greek universities should work. The counterpoint to that is that the system, the way it is built, provides particular incentives. And that is true. The strongest incentive it provides is the incentive to do nothing or to do very little. And the reason it provides this incentive is because there is very little actual evaluation going on. University professors very often say that, you know, in the Greek civil service or public sector, they're among the most rigorously evaluated professional people. And that is true because we go through elections and peer review and all that kind of stuff. But there are two answers to that. One is that the bar is very low against which we're being judged. The rest of the civil sector may have zero evaluation. And the other is that there are no real repercussions for poor evaluation results. So the system is geared towards saying, you know, if you do next to nothing, there is no real consequence. But, you know, if we strive to be better, we can work against this disincentive. The system provides a lot of room for better instruction and better curricula and better educational outcomes. So in this context, and given that we only have 5 minutes, I will mention a few things that we are trying to implement in, that I have tried to implement in my courses at the undergraduate level, and we're also putting as requirements, so to speak, for our professors, for our instructors in the Masters for Data Science. So apparently, as I've also learned relatively recently by studying, which we didn't do in the university because in our career, we learn about many things related to our research, but we don't necessarily learn about how to be better teachers. But through sort of individual studying, I've learned that there are various tricks, if you will, or techniques that make for better learning. And a few of these techniques that are very easy to employ, that we ask all our professors to employ in their courses, are the following. One is spaced learning, so giving students the time to learn the material, not taking explicit steps to make cramming less productive for them. Giving yourself space to learn is a key technique, distributed, I forget the exact word in the learning literature, but it's distributed practice, actually. Distributed practice is key. So we enhance that, or we guide students towards that by having a tight structure with deadlines, with intermediate, with homeworks, with a whole bunch of things that force them to study the material throughout the course, giving lower weight to the final exam and a whole bunch of other techniques like that. The other thing that seems to, that learning research shows works well is, unfortunately for us professors, lots of testing. So lots of different kinds of testing, practice testing, interspersing solved examples with similar but unsolved examples, repeated testing where you test in the midterm material also at the end of the course. Different kinds of testing significantly help student learning. So despite our sort of abhorrence to having a lot of papers to grade, we are asking all faculty to have homeworks, quizzes, take-home problems, in-class exams, to try to have a wide variety of tests throughout the quarter. And we do find that these improve educational outcomes in the sense that grades at final exams seem to be better. Retention, as measured by the professors of follow-on courses, seem to be better. So advanced, I mean, that is anecdotal evidence, but professors at courses that have prerequisites have less complaints, fewer complaints about people not knowing the basic material. And overall, we seem to be getting across to our students because they also, all these efforts make them also do better time management, which is another issue that learning research has shown, that poor time management negatively impacts learning. So by employing all these techniques, which are up to the individual instructor and have exactly zero to do with the legal framework, we have set up a master's program that helps students learn as best as possible and as best as learning research allows. And my sort of optimistic message is that we can do a lot within the constraints of our broken system. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vettas, and you were punctual on time, so, Mr. Vassalos, sorry, because I was thinking of asking Mr. Vettas, does he also think that it's easier than it looks, or perhaps not?
Okay, I'm really honored and humbled to be here. I never got to Stanford. And so it is great. Thank you for your hospitality. In fact, once the question was emailed to us, what can be changed in universities without changing the institutional framework, I started thinking that these Stanford guys must be pretty smart, because I've been thinking about it and I couldn't come up with a single thing. And I will try to explain why, and I actually think that the system is so formalistic and actually, apologies, Vassilis, ridiculous, that, anyhow, maybe you're smarter than me. You are smarter than me. Now, let me say a few things. I'm an economist, which is an unfortunate thing by itself. But in 1980, Greece was ranked 14th in whole of Europe in terms of real GDP per capita. Last year it was ranked 24th. And I believe that if we had precise metrics about all sorts of education, the decline would be similar on that front as well. Now, why would we care about education? And I will come to the question that Ms. Peloni asked me, what can be done, but why do we care about education? If I am an economist, I know that that's the single variable that correlates the best with growth in countries like ours. It is human capital that drives pretty much everything, including also the sustainable quality of institutions. But leaving even economic growth aside, there are two more reasons. One is social mobility, and education is the single best mechanism for that. And the second is to open up your brain, your mind, even as a citizen. It may happen that at some point in your life, you will be asked difficult questions like, do you want to give up your currency? Do you want to belong to the same union with other countries? Do you want to vote for this guy or the other guy? The questions become increasingly complicated, and if you don't have a good education, you cannot even function as a citizen. So education is a prerequisite for democracy. Now, leaving this aside, for those of you who are Greeks and you have, we're actually closing about 10 years of the Greek crisis, so I guess happy birthday, how you say it? All right, where was I? So it's about 10 years, and lots of things have actually happened in these 10 years, like a decline of incomes and the value of your house, and unemployment and brain drain and all these terrible things. But there is one thing that has also happened, which we did have as a problem even in the past, and has become increasingly worse during the crisis, which is that Greece as a society has become increasingly closed and afraid of anything new and anything foreign. Now, we did have this, and actually I have some data to back this up. As an economist, I know that imports and exports was never our thing. We wanted to be inward-looking. Foreign investment was never our thing. Now, it is true that in terms of education, higher education, we're more open than some other countries. That explains the big diaspora over there. However, in general, if you trace anything that has happened during the last 10 years, we are increasingly not taking risks, we are looking in the back mirror, and we're increasingly afraid of anything foreign. Now, it may be, it is because there are these foreigners who are implementing the austerity. So we say foreign, bad, domestic, we know it. However, this goes contrary to any effort to improve education, the education system and the education outcomes. Now, I'm not trying to avoid the question. However, my recommendations have to be tied around this question. How can we make the system more open and willing to experiment? That's what we're lacking. Now, there are specific things that you can do, even in secondary education. I think that rather than having people go through class and same stuff, one of the things that Greek youngsters are lacking is exposure to different humans. And so if you kind of mix classes, if you take them for a month and you take them kind of to France, well, maybe not France, take them somewhere, take them to the UK, take them to Nigeria, allow them to see how people in other parts of the world are, even when they are 17 years old. This actually seems to be amazingly important. Almost all the kids at this age, they see very little future. They kind of, what we are going through trickles down to them. So opening up to what others do is going to be important. Likewise, in universities, given the extremely strict conditions that we have to operate with, probably are the only light that I can realistically see is if we could cook up joint programs with foreign institutions, summer schools, massive exchange programs, so that we can actually copy and exchange ideas. And to some extent this can be done. Perhaps the success of programs, of such programs, is going to be more likely in certain areas like the classics, maybe math, computer science, perhaps a lot less in areas where you have to have a closer relation with the real world. Engineering, economics, medicine. This is because the interface between the education system and the real world in Greece is actually works in a very weak manner. So you can do things that are a little bit more theoretical, but whenever you come to things that are more applied, then you have higher challenges. Now, a couple of more thoughts, and I conclude with this. Things like what my colleague here at the university, Vassilis, was talking about are very important. I would, however, direct in a given avenue, which is one of the things that unfortunately our students, in my opinion, do not learn, certainly not in the university that I know, but I think also in the secondary education, is how to do things, how to be creative. This goes together with not taking risks, with being afraid to experiment. However, in the great majority of college degrees in Greece, you can actually go through 4 years without having to write a single paper. And it isn't only that we are lacking in the area of how to do things, there is a second problem, which is we are especially bad when it comes that these students would have to do things together in groups, okay? Because our learning is completely at an individual level rather than in teams, which actually becomes a massive problem when then these people go and have to go to the real world. My final word has to be about the institutional framework. The talk that we just heard, I thought was amazing in many ways. It came a little bit closer to my heart when I realized that indeed in the States they did operate without a Ministry of Education, and I started dreaming. But now, to be honest, it is not the ministers themselves. Actually, I haven't met any Minister of Education in Greece who was a bad person. Now that I think of it, I haven't met any of them. But now, the problem is that if you have a system that is so centralized, all sorts of incentives go the wrong way, okay? If you happen to be even at, what was it, Cleveland State?
I like the place.
It exists? All right. Now, even at Cleveland State, faculty members, when they get to elect a colleague, they have incentives to elect somebody who is better than them, because the institution will go up, they will attract better students, more money is going to come in. If you think about the incentives that we have in the Greek system to elect somebody who is better than us, these incentives are clearly negative. And we have to fight to bring people who are better than us. So the word incentives has to be clear in this, and I'm finishing. 2 thoughts. First thought, it is one challenge to have to fight against a bad system. But when the state, which of course represents society, it's a democracy, proceeds to a deterioration of the institutional framework, this is worse than having to do with this, because it is a clear signal that even if we know how to do some things, perhaps there isn't enough appetite for this. They're just telling you, just stay back. There is no need to do it. That's not what we collectively want as a society. Now, can you escape somehow? Yes, there are little things you can do. To be honest, as a priority, and unfortunately, we have to do two things. One is we have to keep repeating how bad the framework, the institutional framework is. We do have to do this. And the other thing is to rescue all these bright students, you know, just write them good letters and emphasize in the letters that if they were able actually to make it through the Greek system, they can make it anywhere. Thank you. Actually, give me half a second, okay? I remembered a joke. And this is half a joke. The fact, it is true that the world is becoming increasingly uncertain and maybe chaotic, somebody's gonna say. Certainly not linear. And it is indeed the fact that our students do learn to operate in systems where the rules are changing. This is an asset. I do remember when I was myself in the States, in a lesser school than Stanford. So at some point, I don't remember what course it was, but I think the professor teaching got sick, and then he didn't show up. And I had a German classmate which was kind of shocked. It's like the guy didn't show up, and the Japanese guy was shocked. He didn't show up. And of course, the Greek, the Brazilian, the Italian said, oh, he didn't show up, let's just go. So flexibility might be an asset. Okay, thanks.
On that happy note, on the Greeks being creative and creativity overall, I would like to ask the two professors, and you choose who will speak first, having heard that also, to give us some examples or an experience of good practices that you have applied and or have been engaged to as active educators, just to make it less specific on the Greek example, unless you want to answer specifically on the Greek example. So will it be Mr. Bettinger or Mr. Ramirez? Who would like to? It's up to you.
Very briefly, I'll stay within my 5 minutes. When I was first told you can't do anything about the institutional framework, I had two reactions. One is the Italian sociologist Diego Gamberto, who said about Italian universities, they pretend to pay, we pretend to work. The second was that if you don't change the institutional framework, it's like playing Barcelona or Bayern Munich or Manchester University and saying, but the way we play is we don't play with a goalie. Okay, that's just the way we do things. Okay, so that was my first reaction. My second reaction, though, was actually listening to Vassilis, where he pointed out, look, there's instructional practices. So some of the practices you're referring to are really quite common in American universities, and this was true at San Francisco State University, where I taught for many years before teaching at Stanford. Teaching evaluations are a regular feature, and they're a feature because, in fact, you get evaluated by your dean on how well you taught. So it's a little harder if you have to do it on your own, okay? But clearly, if you know that part of your overall evaluation is your teaching evaluations, that's an incentive to pay attention. And contrary to what he said earlier, Eric always got good teaching evaluations. Okay? He's just making it up when he says that, people didn't like his class. I know that. I saw the evaluation. Oh, here comes Bettinger again, So that's one. The other is the idea of tests, of frequency of tests, different kinds of tests. Again, the opposite of that is the old German system. One exam at the end of the 3 years, okay? And the alternative is a mechanism that provides you with some feedback on what is it that students are actually learning. You may be surprised. They may not be learning as much as you thought they would. So that I think can be done without touching the institutional framework. The only question is, what's the incentive for doing it? The American system, clearly there's an incentive. That's part of your responsibility. And in the business school, the meeting is one of the two associate deans meets face-to-face with faculty to tell them, you know, this was not a very good year. And in the old business school, they used to post the evaluations. Right there in the corridor, you could walk around and going to point to a particular professor in his class. So there's a long tradition of teacher evaluation. There's a long tradition of repeated tests, frequency of tests, different kinds of tests. And it's clear that those of us who are beyond a certain age and are used to lecturing, you know, have had to rethink it. Have had to rethink, do we just have a finals? Do we have short tests and then giving options? Do you have a finals with questions, or do you have a research project that you can use in lieu of that? So yes, I can see that being done. It would be lovely if you could do something about the institutional framework, because once in a while, Greece wins it, as it did some years ago. The football match, okay?
So when we were preparing for this, we each called Vassilis and talked to him a little bit about, you know, his perspectives. And it was one of the things I do is whenever I'm really depressed, I go and I get a candy bar and I just eat the candy bar in a parking lot. And we had an hour-long conversation, and I kept on saying, well, what about this? And he would say, oh, no. And I'd say, well, what about this? And he'd say, oh, no. And so 2 candy bars later, as I was sitting in the parking lot trying to think a little bit about, you know, it's a very constraining system. And let me start by talking about things I think are possible. I mean, one of the things I want to come back to, which we have to confront in one way or another, and it's more a response to some of the other comments. I mean, one of the things that we've tried to stress is that the role of the professor is a lever that we have. We can make that professor more tangible in the development of the student. But one of the other things we have is if our trends are right, we're going to go more and more towards online learning. And one of the things that we find is our cost savings in online learning often comes by basically making it a standardized product. And that actually diminishes the role of the professor. Now, it gets rid of bad teaching, which we know happens, but it also gets rid of those teachers who are willing to do the extra thing in the classroom. And so it's one of the things that we have to confront is, as we think about how to expand technology using technology, how do we make it to where the professor stays in that role, and how do we coach the professor in that way? One of the projects that has been one of my favorite ones that a set of scholars did at UC Davis was they went to these large classes, and they went and they talked to the professors, and the professors in these classes had very little incentive to do strong work and to get some things done. But what they did was they talked to the professor just about what their goals were, and the professors were altruistic in nature. I mean, most of us who go into professorial work, we realize at some point in time that you know, there was we did sign up for poverty in going into that profession. I mean, it's not as remunerative as some of the other things that many of us could have done. But part of the joy that we get is from seeing students learn. And so one of the things that these professors did was they just automated very simple emails and text messages and they randomized which students received these in the classroom. So they took a class of 300 kids, and I don't know the exact number, I'm telling you just kind of the general idea, and they randomly assigned 150 of them to be receiving messages from the professors. They made it to where it was almost zero cost for the professors. They basically gave them, here's the text, if you give us permission, we will send these all from your email account. The students' responses were amazing. I've never had a professor write me individually. I've never had feedback about a specific test. They sent the students who had failed at the exam, the fact that the professor reached out to them made it to where they wanted to do better. There was an accountability factor that the student now felt because they felt like the professor knew who they were and was observing them. So one of the things that they did was, one of the things we often lack is how do we reach out to the one student? I mean, when I was teaching undergraduates, I would see 400 undergraduates each week. My ability to identify one of them and to say this particular student needs help on this particular concept, given the other responsibilities I had at the university, I had almost no incentive to do it. I would have loved to have done it, but I don't have the time or the means. And so if we can create mechanisms by which the professor can relay that type of encouragement and criticism in positive ways, we'd be surprised how much professors might actually rise to that. The other point I wanted to make is, I wrote a paper about this last year about being somewhat critical about online learning and where we're at right now. But one of the points I tried to make in this is that we're in the infancy of these types of technological approaches. There are some classrooms right now where, especially in math, where we can really identify where a student's at, where we can customize instruction, and we can have an entire room where almost every student is receiving an individualized math lesson, and the professor's role becomes less about giving a lecture and more about when a specific student faces a concept and they can't figure it out, for the professor to give one-on-one work. That one-on-one attention is important, and we're going to reach a point in that instructional design that our technological capacities to provide that type of individualized attention is there. Getting ourselves ready for that. Last point, and I know we're standing between cocktails, so we should, and this one's hard. I mean, I go along with the statement, we need to continue to hammer that there are institutional improvements that can be there. One of the statements that one of the former provosts at Stanford once made to me was, we never waste a crisis. And one of his points is that oftentimes the windows that we have to make a change, to close a program, to introduce a new program, to try to, can occur in those moments of need. And you know, I know it's near to impossible in many of the fronts. You know, my 2 candy bars in the parking lot were my testament to that some of this is difficult. But as we find ways to think about where there might be waves of energy and enthusiasm, for example, like institutional accountability is an issue that has come up and that there is some look at it. And if we can figure out how to construct that in a way that can actually provide greater incentives, we can actually do something more positive and something that might actually be more systemic and long-lasting in its effect. So I'll leave it at that and go.
Thank you. Listening to you, Professor Bettinger, I was wondering, speaking about students and the role of incentives and accountability, and of course this question is directed to all the speakers or whoever wants to answer it, what the role of the students also is, or of individual stakeholders in applying best practices. Is there any, or is it up to the deans and the professors only, and they don't get a role in it? So, and also the question is for Mr. Ramirez and for the Greek professors as well. So shall we start the other way around, or start from?
Let's keep the same order.
Okay.
Nikos seems to indicate.
Okay.
So, so there are 2 stakeholders, I think, that primarily matter when it comes to the educational outcomes. There is a silent one that I don't want to speak about, which is the state. But again, I'll stick to the script and not comment. One is the students. The other, you know, our society being as it is the students' families. And these are the 2, I mean, apart from the professors, these are the main stakeholders. And obviously their importance is humongous. My experience has been that most, well, I don't know about most, but a very significant percentage of students responds to better instruction, better designed curricula, more effort on the part of the professors. So respond positively, just to be clear. So we have that stakeholder eager to try harder and do more if the product offered is of better quality. It's not so clear to me what the families want. The support, the family support, the role of the family in the educational attainment of students is not so clear to me in Greece anymore. And the crisis has shown families, and I know this will be controversial, to not necessarily be a positive mechanism through which Greeks have processed the reality of the crisis. And this goes for education as well. The pressure for students to remain, for example, near to the home, I mean, has a real basis in the finances, but it doesn't always jibe with good educational results and outcomes. So there is a stakeholder that universities traditionally have not reached out to because students are adults, etc., but the social reality points to the need to sort of reach out more and understand better, you know, how society wants to, what society wants and what these units, the cells of society that in Greece are the families, what they want out of the university education. And we might not like what we find out. So that's my answer.
Mr. Vettas.
I don't have any bright ideas other to obviously recognize that what you're saying is extremely important. We do have, we have to leverage back the energy that the students do have so that they can help us help them. Now, this is way too theoretical. Certainly when you try to apply this has to be done differently at different places. There are, depending by discipline, also not all the students are equally capable in all universities and all departments, which is actually something that we do have to recognize. Part of the problem in Greece is that the system is trying to make everybody the same. Not everybody is the same, and not everybody wants to be the same. Depending on where we are, we have to give freedom for students to fully support a system that will support them. I'm going to stop here because you know, getting into concrete ways for how to do it is going to take us a really long time. But you are certainly putting your finger in the right place.
I've taught in two very different places. One was, at that time at least, a commuter school, which meant students would come, take courses, but generally they were also working, and so they were not around the campus. That was San Francisco State. And I've taught at Stanford, which is a residential place, and students are typically not working. So student engagement is, in one way, much easier at a place like Stanford, where you often have student guilds. You have students who are interested in, often at the forefront of thinking about different ways of learning. So that's not hard. It obviously is hard in a system where you have one exam at the end, where you can be there for many, many years, you know, where all the disincentives are lined up. I think broadly, I've always thought, would it be so hard to have a conference on how do students learn, where you invite, not in a confrontational manner, but you invite people from the state, in this case the Ministry of Education, people from the civil society, whether they be philanthropy. Just, I would think that people would be interested in how do students learn and what can we do to facilitate their learning. And to me, a first step is to have this kind of conversation between different potential stakeholders in a non-confrontational manner. So it's not, we are having this conference to demand, where you immediately put the other side on the defensive. I don't know whether it's feasible here, but it's the one idea I had. Find a topic where you think a lot of different stakeholders will be interested, students will be interested, and see how you can get that conversation going if this is a major problem.
In much of the work that I've done where we've interviewed students and ask them about, you know, specific courses they're taking or specific exercises they do, they often say something, you know, I've already shared some of that, you know, that they've done this for reasons they don't necessarily understand or reasons that are not well-founded. And one of the interesting experiences that I had over the last couple of years was I've been working with a for-profit college in the United States, a very large one. And asking that for-profit college, you know, looking at some of the curriculum that they're doing, And it's really interesting to me that their very first assignment in the very first class that every student's required basically has two components. The first component is, why do you want the degree? Or in other words, why are you taking this class? And number two, what are the barriers for you to succeed in this class? And that's the first two questions they ask those students. Now, what their goal is, it's a little bit like that coaching example that I gave in my talk earlier, that when they had that kid on the phone, the kid was just unmotivated. He didn't understand why he was in the course. He didn't understand why this assignment was important. But as soon as he recognized and drew the link between his career objectives and the learning objectives in that class, his motivation changed. He understood that this was not, oh, I have to do this. This was, I'm doing this to learn a specific skill that will help me to achieve a specific professional goal. You know, there's a lot of different ways we can do this, but one of the things I think that is instructive is the more that the students can own the process and the objective, and the less separation there is between the ultimate objective and the objective that they're doing in the class, the more that we can make those to where those are more proximate, the better the chance we are of having students really engage fully in the process.
On this very important note of ownership, which seems to be an issue in Greece generally, I will open the floor now to the public for questions, and please here on the left.
I would like to ask, do you think that when private universities are allowed to operate in Greece, would that drive the public universities to change as well, and in consequence, the secondary education to adapt to how the private universities work? And Professor Ramirez, I want to say that I deliberately used the optimistic word, when private universities are allowed, based on the part of my life I've spent in the US, so I have to be optimistic.
Thank you. So, would you like a specific speaker to answer the question, or it's...
One Greek and one American.
Okay. It's up to you. I'm not going to instruct you. So, who would like to answer first? Mr. Vettas?
Professor Vettas.
Okay.
Who's first?
In some sense, there is the obvious and the expected question to your answer to your question, which is yes, it's going to help. It's going to help through more resources, and it's going to help through more competition. This is item number one in the answer. However, the success that such a new system will have is not guaranteed. There is a lot to say that just by opening up without improving the backbone of the system, which has to be the public university system, for many reasons, the outcome might be inferior than the expectations. So you need two things for this to succeed, in my view. You cannot ask, as I said, it has to be the backbone of the system, the public universities, for reasons that we can go up in length. I am all in favor with opening up the system with all sorts of education. In fact, it's hard to explain to somebody, if you allow private kindergartens, why you don't allow private universities. Leaving that aside, I have to emphasize that waiting for the when that you said is not all the answer. You have to free up the hands of the existing institutions, and you have to create a system of right incentives when the system is going to create. One last word. An education system doesn't exist in a vacuum. First of all, one of the things that was discussed before when the comparison came to the secondary system and the university system in the States One thing that, in my humble opinion, is also different is that the university system in the US incorporates a lot of foreigners in the faculty as well as the students. This is something that is different from the secondary system, obviously. And in some sense, this is kind of feeding up to the success of the US economy. The success of the US economy, like it was also for the British, was that it created a hub where you would attract, in some ways, the best people from around the world, educate them, but then make them part of the system. But that wouldn't work if people did not have, so people don't only go to Stanford just because Stanford is good. They go to Stanford because this is an entrance to the US job market. And unless we also see an opening up, an improvement of the Greek economy, just to improve whatever we have to improve in the education system by itself is not going to work. Right now we have, what I guess I'm saying in simple words, and I'm stopping here, is that you can increase the supply, but there has to be demand. And right now, the demand is very little, okay? So we have to be optimistic, but it's gonna take a lot of design and a lot of effort.
That was a fantastic answer. No, I mean, I think it actually encapsulates a lot of the limitations and potential that could be there. I think the one thing that I would just add is the whole nature of the business of higher education is it's a business based on cross-subsidies. And a lot of those cross-subsidies either come directly from the state, or in the private situation, either has to come from either endowment dollars or from tuition dollars. And those are the models that are out there. The hard part is if the cross-subsidy doesn't exist, and what I mean by that is, you know, if I have a lucrative program that I'm putting out there, like a business program where my overhead is low, I generate additional revenue that can then support some other part of the university. There's a reason why at most poor private universities, and by poor I don't mean quality-wise, I mean just not having the presence of a cross-subsidy, they don't do a lot of training in things like use of an MRI machine. Those are expensive. We need something to kind of cross-subsidize to help us buy that equipment at a private institution that's going to be difficult unless I have another program that's very profitable. And so what you see is almost two classes of private schools in the United States. One which has large endowments that provide that cross-subsidy, or access to research funds that provide that cross-subsidy, or ones that charge very high tuition but focus on high programs that seemingly have low costs and potentially a market for high tuition. And so we wind up having this kind of bifurcated market in private education that is difficult to construct without some type of cross-subsidy in place on some of it. In countries that have tried to establish it, they've tried to establish it on the backs of large gifts. The private universities that have emerged in Latin America, for example, have almost all been based on some private organization or foundation coming in and laying the foundation so that the endowment can generate and provide the cross-subsidy for other programs. Otherwise, we wind up in a world where we can, you know, have 80 business schools, but nothing that goes outside of the kind of business school and communications. Information technology is probably the only one we've been successful at getting programs that have a little bit more expense to them because there's a high market for those and the salaries are better.
Yes, please.
One topic which could be implicit in your beautiful presentations, yet was not too transparent to us, was the level of education that we are targeting is referring, you know, towards the average student, the top student, or the bottom student. And how does this differ from university to university? Let me help you with this a little bit. For example, in the Greek institutions, if you get the top students, they don't differ very much from students from top universities all over. But if you go to Scuola Normale Superiore in Italy, and you take the bottom student, that bottom student, if you compare him with the bottom students in many, many places, he's so much better. So an educational program at a higher education, the ideal that we say, do you target the average student, the top student, or the bottom student in terms of standards of learning as the primary focus, and how does this differ from universities of excellence to average universities to lower quality universities, and how does this relate to your dropout rates, right? Be careful on the chart that you first showed us in your beautiful speech. Yeah.
Thank you.
Try to take a stab at it. For most, at least Greek departments, the difference between the top students and the bottom students, for most, not for all of them, but for most Greek departments, the difference between the top and the bottom students is mostly motivation. So more strongly internally motivated students manage to survive in an environment that offers them relatively little in terms of incentives, if you will. So if they have strong internal incentives, they do well. So better constructed curricula and better instructional methods would give us a smaller, would thin the tails of the distribution. That's a hypothesis, but this is what, as I said, we see in a relatively small sample in our masters. There is only 35 students in the class, but the difference between the best student and the worst student is much less pronounced than it is in our undergraduate program. Of course, the undergraduate program is larger. There is also a level of preparation that there might be a difference there, but for most Greek departments, because the spread of the grades, for entering students is not that humongous, either in the poor departments, all the students are ill prepared. In the better departments, most students are well prepared. So that's, I think we can target the average student and help move everyone up.
Yes, Professor Ramirez.
Were you concerned about sort of growing inequality between universities? I wasn't quite sure what your concern was. It's just that the distribution of students in terms of their abilities in top universities, the distribution is rather narrow. Okay. So, you're not, the programs are not aimed for the top because, in fact, the distribution is rather narrow. I don't know how it compares to the distribution in other kinds of universities. I can sort of anecdotally say that when I taught at San Francisco State, there were some students who probably could have gone to Stanford and done well, but all Stanford students could go to San Francisco State and do well. So the differences are between institutions.
Thank you, Mr. Ramirez, and I'm sure the professors will be happy to talk more over the cocktail because it's getting late. I don't know if there are any candy bars available, but it was an optimistic discussion after all, so we can talk more over cocktail. Thank you all very much.